This is 1.4, Learning A, New Immigration. Please add 3 pieces of information for each slide that has written notes on it. Here you see some pictures of immigration on the left of people coming into the United States during the Gilded Age. And on the right you have a chart that actually explains quite a bit about immigration in the United States. If you'll notice that immigration has a lot of ups and downs during the Gilded Age, but it certainly has a lot more people coming in and is much larger than the eras either before or after it. This is true because of the massive amount of world events and the exploding economy of the United States. You can see also that the total number of immigrants increased, with a large portion of them being Southern and Eastern European immigrants by the end of the Gilded Age. Notice the things that create the downturns in immigration are also the economic depressions at each point here, you can see. All right, old immigrants versus new. Old immigrants are came into the United States approximately from 1800 to 1880. So that's 80 years with about 10 million immigrants. These are your typical British, German, Sweden, Norway, even some Irish people in that time period, WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Many of them are farmers. That's why, for example, in Iowa we have a lot of Germans and Irish and Swedes and Norwegians. In Wisconsin and Minnesota they have a lot of Norwegians as well. They fit in pretty good with the British colonists and the British descendants that were made up the vast majority of Americans. But by the time 1880 comes, in a mere 30 years, 18 million immigrants come, and they come from different places. They come from Southern and Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, or they were Czech, Greek, Hungarian, Italian, Russian, and Polish. And these types of people were significantly different: Catholics, Orthodox Christian, or Jewish. Russia and Poland had a really large Jewish population. On top of that, there were many Chinese and Japanese immigrants that were coming into the United States on the West Coast. Again, most of the immigration increases coincided with an increasing economy and a demand for low-skilled or unskilled workers in the United States economy. In class, I talked about the difference between emigration with an E on the top or immigration with an I on the bottom. People emigrate from Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Turkey, France, England, Holland, Ireland, etc. And they immigrate to, with an I, to the United States. Of course, they didn't immigrate only to the United States. There were many people that went to Canada or to South America or other places as well. But as far as U.S. history goes, you can see that many people not only moved to the United States or immigrated to the United States, but they clumped in places with other like immigrants, people who came from the same country as them. Push factors are just reasons why people left their country. Religious persecution is an example. The Jewish people have faced religious persecution pretty much wherever they've gone since since the beginning of their religion. That's certainly the case with them. And poverty, because of population increase, is also a push factor that pushes people out of their current country. A lot of Italians, for example, or Chinese people had poverty in their country, widespread poverty, so they were looking for employment. Also, there's land failures and blights and crop destruction that occurred that drove farmers out of their current country and came to the fertile lands of the United States. And then there's various wars where people would want to avoid. Now, the pull factors are the things that make people come to the U.S., okay, or to wherever that they went. Of course, there's free land for the home because of the 1862 Homestead Act, so that drew lots of farmers. Economic opportunity. The Industrial Revolution opened up unskilled jobs. You didn't need to know how to make shoes to be on a shoe factory line. You didn't need to know how to make steel specifically. You had to just be able to perform one task in the steel mill, and you could be trained at that relatively quickly. So people without, young men, especially without any particular skill, had a lot of opportunities in the United States to get a job. Many of those jobs were low paying, but they still had opportunities. And the United States, until 1882, had open immigration policies. In fact, there was very little impediment, very little hurdles to get into the United States. So all of those things encouraged people to come. Ellis and Angel Island are basically a filter. Okay, they're places that immigrants filtered through to make sure that that there were no undesirables. They were largely a response to the massive numbers of immigrants during the Gilded Age and sort of some nativist xenophobic thoughts, right? So Ellis Island was opened towards the end of the Gilded Age, and basically it was a process center. They deported some people by Manhattan Island. The actual process was a 2 to 5 hour process, and depending on how long the line was or what was wrong with the particular immigrant, 29 questions about the name, how much money they had, and their health. If they were determined to be sick or a criminal or something of that unsound mind, they were sent home or they were held in a hospital. Okay, the island today, you can look up it on Google Maps. Just type in Ellis Island, and you can see how close it is to the how close it is to the Statue of Liberty and to Manhattan Island, where the Twin Towers were. Now, Ellis Island starts with an E, and most of the immigrants that came there were European, which also, by the way, starts with an E. Angel Island starts with an A, in case you couldn't tell, and most of the immigrants that came through Angel Island were from Asia, which also starts with an A. That's a good way to remember it. Again, the fever pitch of nativist and xenophobic fears was in the early 1900s, in the first decade. So by 1910, Angel Island was created. Basically, instead of finding reasons to allow people in, Angel Island was basically a detention center where they held people and tried to find a reason to not let them in, specifically the Chinese. Immigrants often were held for days or weeks during interrogation. And even when they got through, they're in a very isolated place. Angel Island today is by San Francisco. Again, you could use Google Maps to see it today. You can tell here that population by foreign birth in 1880, there's an enormous amount up in Minnesota and the Dakotas and Wisconsin. And so you see a lot of the places that have high immigrant populations are in the West. However, by the time 1900 rolls around and the Eastern and Southern European immigrants are coming in force, they're starting to locate themselves in big cities. You can see in Chicago and in New York City by Connecticut and Rhode Island. You can see that these places are places that really started seeing a massive number of immigrants, even though the former places in the previous slide are still high immigrant populations. So finally, the United States started restricting immigration or cutting it off. And of course, it starts off with the Chinese, because Chinese immigrants would come, they would take jobs, and then they would leave. On top of that, they were, the other. They looked different, they acted different. They did not use a Latin-based language where they had, the same letters as us, as Americans, and they had the different religions, Buddhism and Confucianism, and those were nothing like Christianity. So federal law all but cut off immigration from China. This is the only immigration restriction to this point, and it actually goes from the 1880s to, I believe, about the 1950s. In 1907, there was an agreement between the United States and Japan. Basically, Japanese students would be treated as white students, and they would be allowed into white schools if Japan would end immigration to the United States. It pretty much did. Again, why do you think the only restrictions are for Asian American immigrants? Because Americans are xenophobic, and Asians look and act significantly different than the standard population of the United States. Americans have always been resistant to change.